It's a Kellogg Conversations event. We're exploring how researchers and practitioners are tackling sustainability challenges, both social and environmental challenges. And tonight, we're focusing specifically on the role of community and cooperation. So we'll look at what does it take to work collaboratively and drive collective action at the local level, but also at the global level. And we'll look at the connections between those. And I'm really thrilled to be joined in the conversation by four remarkable leaders across research and practice who are working on collaboration, community, and cooperation for sustainability challenges. And I'll just briefly introduce them, but then they'll share in their opening comments much more about their work and how they think about these issues. So first we have, let's see, I'll go in the order that you're sitting in, not what's on my sheet. Mac McKenzie, who's the CEO and co-founder of Bridge Institute. We have Jenny Richmond, who is partner at Impact Works Associates and also a founding member of Ringo Project, which is at the West Africa Civil Society Institute. We have Bart Ashton, who is manager of Zero Carbon Oxfordshire Partnership. And we have Matt Amengual, who's a colleague of mine at the Business School, associate professor in international business at Said Business School at Oxford, and also a fellow of Kellogg College. So welcome to all of you. We'll get into the discussion. We'll do about 40 minutes or so of conversation moderated up here, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with all of you. And so I want to start, Bart, with you. And because we're focusing on community and in particular sort of the role of local community and how local communities can engage on sustainability challenges. And that's, of course, at the core of what you do. So tell us a little bit about that work, the work you do locally to address sustainability challenges. And in particular, how do you foster collaboration and motivate collective action around sustainability?
Thank you very much, and hello to everyone. That sounds like quite an ambitious question to start with, but we'll give it a go. So, yes, my name is Bart Ashton. My role, my day job is currently as the partnership manager for something called the Zero Carbon Oxfordshire Partnership, which brings together mostly large and influential employers and organisations in the county, previously in the city of Oxford. So that's definitely fostering collaboration on a daily basis. But also on top of that, I've been involved in other Oxford social enterprises such as Good Food Oxfordshire and Makespace Oxfordshire, two most obvious examples for this role, for this conversation, who are networkers and conveners of all sorts of community collaboration. So that's the kind of experience that I'll be sort of using to talk this evening. And that question about how do we foster collaboration in a community? I mean, I think that the kind of things I'm going to talk about we'll hear across the piece. I think also my recurring theme will be the collaboration. True collaboration is actually really quite hard, quite often. Not coordination, but collaboration, where people are changing what they do, they're compromising, they're working together, they're doing different things, not only for their benefit, for the benefit of others. That comes quite naturally to lots of people, but actually also does not come naturally to lots of people and lots of organisations. So there's something just about the nature of it which is demanding. So I have found, I think, in reflection on this, that strong alignment is essential. You've got to find people or organisations with whom you're aligned, or who the purpose that you're going for is aligned. Inevitably, you will have to have trust. Trust is really at the core of it, and trust is a personal thing. I've usually found that it comes from starting small and growing from the core. So typically small groups of well-aligned organisations or people, I think, play into that. And in the community sectors, so there's kind of groups is maybe not quite grassroots, but not far off from Good Food Oxfordshire, for instance, or Makespace. They're actually trying to do difficult things with very limited resources. So the capacity to be able to work together in this collaborative way is often lacking. And so in the end, I realised in thinking about this conversation, quite a lot of what I do is about adding capacity, supporting, convening, helping, assisting, getting in there to allow those people with who have got partners but have got bold ambitions and maybe limited capacity to be able to work together. And those are the kind of themes I think that I have seen in community-based collaboration.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm actually going to ask you a quick follow-up question
Yeah,
before
good.
we move on, which is there an example that you could share of a collaboration you guys have been involved in that worked well in illustrating the qualities that you talked about, recognizing the real challenge of true collaboration, as you said?
I've often used this example, but it is actually really interesting for this topic, and it's quite relevant to here. So, a project that Good Food Oxfordshire have been involved in the last couple of years is combined or convening groups of Oxfordshire-based food growers, vegetable farmers, market gardeners, and Oxford colleges to buy. So it's a sell and to buy really locally, and you getting when I've seen groups of Oxford College chefs literally smelling the soil in a field, completely out of context. You realise that they've gone out of their way, so they're aligned. They've taken some time out. They're committed, and that's taken quite a long time to grow, but has been a really interesting example of that collaboration where you might not expect it.
Yes, thank you. Okay, Jenny, I want to turn to you. So you work really with organizations that are working to engage local communities and also with funders that are trying to direct funding and engage in funding in more participatory approaches, participatory grant making, locally led resourcing, and similar strategies. And so tell us a little bit about what you have seen from that vantage point in terms of the challenges to fostering the kinds of collaboration that Bart talked about, and what you have seen to work to really enable that true collaboration, particularly with the players that you're working with that are not sort of sitting at the local level, but really trying to catalyze and foster that.
Thank you. Yeah, so a lot of my work, so I work as an independent consultant now, but I've also worked within some big international NGOs and within government funding and also within private philanthropy, worked for Comic Relief for quite a while, etc. So sort of had different angles on the international aid, development, humanitarian sector and environmental sector. So I thought that work might be useful, even though I work in the UK as well, it might be useful to sort of reflect on that more systemic piece. And I think there are lots of obstacles to communities taking the lead within a sort of international system of connection and solidarity, if you like. So from the starting point is that we need global players, we need regional players, we need community activists and energizers and mobilizers to face the huge challenges that we're facing in the world today. So everyone has their part to play. The challenge at the moment is that we have a system of funding and a system of sort of organizational support, connection, programs as they're traditionally known, which has come from a slightly different age in a sense. It's grown up from a post-colonial world. It's grown up in the context of sort of classic perceptions of poor people over there and wealthier countries as funders. That world is gone, is completely disrupted and is changing by the minute, right? So the funding system that we have, the system of sort of international NGOs that tell us stories about other people's lives in communities and other places is sort of absolutely in a process of disruption right now. So a lot of the obstacles that I see in my work, and I work a lot with international NGOs or funders trying to think this stuff through. So what should they be in the future, given the changes in the world right now? How should they be evolving? How should they be facilitating the best solidarity, funding flows, etc., between people in different places and different countries? And a lot of the sort of obstacles to that are perceptions, trust, sort of miseducation, if you like, of what communities can be responsible for. So the classic model of like, yeah, but we've got to do our due diligence to make sure that our funds flow right through. And, that's whether it be the taxpayer. I worked for DFID when it was DFID, now it's the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, a development office. Whether it be the taxpayer or whether it be the donor putting some, a tenner in a box with Oxfam, it's equally important that people understand that actually those who a best place to make decisions about interventions are those who are closest to the activity, closest to the experience of an inequality or an environmental challenge. So yeah, I think there's quite a few challenges I can dive back into, but I'll leave it there for now.
Great. Well, I do have a follow-up question for you as well, which is, so recognizing those challenges, again, you've worked in sort of with a lot of different organizations and approaches. Is there one that stands out or an example you might offer in terms of where you've seen those challenges be tackled or overcome effectively?
I won't give one example, if that's okay, because I do work as a consultant and I probably shouldn't. But I think a lot of international NGOs are asking themselves really tough questions right now about how they can be the best ally or supporter or accompanier to communities in different places. And I think the best approach to them finding that future is to really ask themselves a tough question about their particular role and the power that they have in whether that be money or whether it be sort of contact and opportunity, whether it be voice in the UN forum or whatever, but asking themselves really tough questions about how they can listen the best to communities, how they can actually direct resources advised by communities rather than assuming their own sort of knowledge, and how they can sort of work together, just picking up on some of your reflections about how they can work together in the most strategic way to actually change the system as a whole. So yeah, rather than one example, an expansion. Sorry, Marya.
Okay. I'll let you off that. Thank you. So Mac, I want to come to you. As we've talked about collaboration at the local level, we've talked about what does it take, or really what are the obstacles for the sort of global players to catalyze, foster, and resource that. And you're often working really with some of those global and regional players and really working to catalyze collaboration across at that level. And I know that you've got a particularly distinctive approach in doing so. And so it would be wonderful if you could share a little bit about the work you do at the Bridge Institute and how you work to foster collaboration amongst regional and global players, and in what ways is that similar to or different from what we've heard from Bart's description of what it takes at the local level?
Perfect. So thank you for having me, and it's great to be here. So 12 years ago, just how this all started was I was working with a big global organization, and they were applying the most amazing methodologies to solving these big global problems and collaborating across the whole world and bringing and tapping into the great works of great universities, etc. And I got really inspired by the question do we apply these levels of thinking that we apply to organizations to the big global problems? And short, I went and met someone at the UN and said, does anyone apply this level of thinking to the big global problems we see in climate and in wars, etc.? And his answer was, on the whole, no. And so decided to apply all these methodologies went to a conflict zone in Asia and 12 years ago, and started applying what a really progressive and inspiring organization might apply to themselves to a conflict zone. And we were just blown away by it. And I know that I had 17 slides I wanted to show you, but Marya gave me a look and said, you can have one. And so I've got one. I'm fighting to hold on to that. And we over 12 years have now taken on challenges about combating human trafficking, child marriage, refugee crisis, etc. And lots of things have gone right and lots of things have gone wrong. And what we've looked at is that when it all goes right, what have we done? And this is what we've come up with, my one slide. Going to spend a lot of time on it now. And so we call it the spiral breakthrough. And the idea is that in any complex problem, there are multiple root causes. There's never one single panacea. So you've got to, first of all, work out what are the points of leverage that if you pull will change everything. So if you look at climate, or if you look in the conflict zone, or if you look in inequality or gender-based violence, there will be multiple root causes. And then you prioritize those. And then we build powerful coalitions around them. And what's particular about that is we have a concept called looking backwards, looking forward, and looking deeper. So looking backwards are traditional sources of power, being very focused. Who's got the money? Who's got the political power? The looking forward are who are the pioneers. And again, universities are often so amazing in this space. And then the looking deeper, which is something really important to us, is who are the unlistened voices, the overlooked voices. And in every problem, there are huge amounts of overlooked voices, kind of the people who are closest on the ground, as you're speaking about. And so we get really focused on that. And then that magic happens when the overlooked voices, like, for example, when we're working on combating human trafficking, we get commercial sex workers and survivors to be at the heart of everything we do, working with big employers and politicians, etc., and police. Then we bring people together for breakthrough and then partner impact. And then the impact is after partnering the breakthrough, we have a roadmap, and we'll then spend maybe 4 or 5 years delivering that, working across the system. And the metaphor of the spiral breakthrough is it starts with 10 people working out the points of leverage, then enroll 100, then 1,000, then 1,000,000 people. And that's kind of where we've ended up. And I think that's the end of my slides. So there we go. Is that good enough start?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. And before I go to Matt, I want to come back to you, Barb, because Matt has described sort of a very sort of specific and structured process here, and I'm curious as to how that resonates. I'm guessing you don't use sort of exactly the same words, but I'm curious as to like how that resonates with the way that you work to build collaboration locally.
Yeah, thanks. Can't quite see the slide from here, but anyway, a lot of similarities there. I think I was particularly just come from a meeting, a board meeting of Makespace actually, who I think have really, when we've been looking back, looking forward, and looking deeper, really recognised those kind of ideas. So that's an organisation that's working on what it calls spatial justice. So who has access to the buildings and the spaces in Oxford to be able to do work who wouldn't otherwise get it. And there you really are looking backwards to the people who have the landowners, the landlords, the people with the authority and the assets. You're looking forward to people like Makespace who are seeing that it could be done differently, and really looking deeper to hear from the people who could benefit from those spaces and what they could do if they could just have access for a little while. And so absolutely that it definitely feels scalable in that respect to me.
Okay, thank you. So Matt, I want to come to you now and sort of pick up on two things. So we've talked about local and collaboration locally. We've talked about the regional and global and how those players can not just collaborate but support local collaborative efforts. You're coming at this from, I think, a slightly different angle. You're looking at sort of the intersection of local and global in your research, but particularly the role of global firms and their interaction with, engagement with local communities. So tell us a bit about that work and what you see about what can work well in those interactions in terms of sustainability and social impact, and also where things fall apart and what explains those differences.
Okay, great. Before doing that, I'd like to say I use the Library of Things to reduce carbon in my home. So you're double thank you. You've had an impact on my life. So thanks. It's really interesting to be here, and it's quite intimidating as an academic because I don't actually do any of these things. You guys are out there like actually changing the world, and I just kind of look about and write about when people change the world, which feels really inadequate. But I'll tell stories of other people doing things, and then perhaps that will be helpful. So one of the industries that I've been working on for some time is the mining industry. And everyone needs the stuff from mining industry. We need it for green transitions, but we generally don't like what they do when they come to town. If a mine decided to open up in Fort Meadow, we'd all be out protesting and we wouldn't be very happy. And so it creates a really strong sustainability challenge in the places where the mines operate because they get all the negative effects socially and environmentally, and often historically have not captured much of the gains of that economic activity. So a multinational comes to town and says, we're going to build a gold mine or a silver mine or a zinc mine in your community. People have seen that movie before. They've seen that movie for 500 years before, and the question is, what can shift it? And the mining industry has changed in part in the last 25 years because of a global phenomenon, which is the strengthening of human rights protections and the strengthening of transnational advocacy groups that put pressure on companies not to do what they used to do, which is when the people start protesting and say, we don't want you to build that mine, or we're worried about contamination, or we want more benefits, they would throw them in jail or they would shoot them. It's much harder to do that in large portions of the world, thanks to a lot of tireless work that people have done. So that's a really important global phenomenon, right? So some of my work has been in Bolivia, which has been a mining country for a very long time. And I've looked at what happens when communities have risen up and tried to extract more out of the extractive companies. So the extractive companies are extracting from their communities, but what can they get? So some of it is collaboration and some of it's contestation and quite conflictual, throwing dynamite, kidnapping managers of companies, those kinds of things. It's all kind of mixed into one mess. And what I found, which is really interesting, is that sometimes when communities mobilize and demand to get more out of these big multinational companies, they wind up doing it, and other times they fail. And when they fail, it can be because they weren't able to put enough pressure on the companies, but it's often that the way they put pressure on the companies and the way they negotiated with companies pushed towards resolutions to those conflicts that didn't solve their sustainability or social problems. So one company that I was looking at was in Potosi, in a place called Porto. They had gone in. We're gonna build a big a silver mine, actually take over an existing one, and we're gonna do all these social development programs that sound great. We're gonna try to diversify the local economy. We're gonna have greenhouses so people can grow their own food. We're going to work on metallurgy so people can get more value added, making jewelry instead of just sending the silver out of the country. All sounds great. What happens? The local artisanal miners blockade the mine, blow it up, have violent conflicts, shut down the whole community. They don't want that. They want access to more minerals. They want the multinationals out. What does the company do to solve that problem? They buy those people off by giving them access to minerals. And they re-entrench that unsustainable local development and that local inequality. They solved their problem with the community, but they did so in a way that did not actually foster local development. So I'll tell a more positive story. Another mine, just a 4-hour drive south, started off kind of like that. They were building the mine, they promised all kinds of things, they didn't deliver. What happened? The community shut them down, kidnapped the managers, threw dynamite at them, everybody's in a bunch of chaos. The mining company's losing $1 million a day, and they had a choice. At that point, they could have tried to find the leaders who they could buy off, who would demobilize, or they could try to create a structure where they can negotiate with a more encompassing, more legitimate leadership that was going to be interested in the community's interest in the long run, not just lining their own pockets. That latter move, which was actually kind of risky, the easier sort of thing to do is divide and conquer. This company decided not to do that, and they were lucky that the community had a structure in place of encompassing community organizations that they could negotiate with. And they set up a council that tried to make plans for local development, and they tried to run the money through that council, and they invested in agriculture and healthcare and education and job training. It didn't go smoothly. There was a little bit of a mess. People weren't happy. They had to shut down the mine again for another week and renegotiate. But what happened was that this process created incentives for the company to solve its political problems through real contributions to local sustainable development, not through lining the pockets of powerful strongmen. So what's interesting from a global and local perspective is often when we look at this globally, we look at what we are demanding of companies, we say, build schools, don't pollute the environment, support healthcare, but who gets into those schools? Who gets access to those jobs, to that healthcare? It's very hard to see from the outside. You could do that in a way that really doesn't support development, and you could do that in a way that does. And what we don't spend very much time doing is telling companies, build structures of collaboration with the community that have these characteristics that are going to make it so that when you take these actions that support sustainable development, it is going to solve your political problems. That we try to align those. Now, they're much harder things to observe from afar, but there are ways in which we can make it happen. So on the one hand, I see the global as really difficult in that it's super incomplete. We tell these companies to do these things, and what happens on the ground, who knows? But on the other hand, it plays a really important role at a minimum of making sure that you can't shoot the protesters, and at a maximum of getting structures in place that align those incentives in ways that we would want in the long term. And that requires a slightly different lens of how we think about what performance is. Performance is how we collaborate rather than the outputs of what we're actually doing. And it's difficult. It's hard to sell. You can't put it on brochures. But it seems to be a deeper way of dealing with this local and global collaboration in highly contentious, highly unsustainable, but important industries.
Okay, thank you. And really interesting examples. I want to pick up on the second one because it sounds like a key piece of what enabled that to work was that there were structures in the local community that existed. And so, I hesitate to say, well, is the implication like local communities need to have those structures in some sense, but that clearly facilitated the process. And so I want to use that to sort of open it up a bit. What is it that will facilitate local interests, local voices being heard in a sort of distributed fashion, right? Not just the loudest or the strongest or the most powerful. And you've had that in your case, and maybe some reflections from you first on that, Matt, but then I would also welcome others' views as well, Jenny and Bart and Mac, what you have seen that can facilitate local interest being heard in that local global connection.
So, briefly, I would say, at least in my research, I was looking at companies interacting with communities. Companies could not construct those encompassing groups themselves. They could not break them, which is actually really, really, really important. But it's going to be other actors like people around here who are building them. And I think the other thing I would say is that in the cases that I looked at, there was a very important that they had two attributes. One is that they were built prior to when everything set off, and the other is that they were reflected in people's, not just their social organization, but also their economic organization. So if you had a community split between miners and farmers, it was much harder to do. And then you had to build on those sort of pre-existing social structures that interestingly, at least in my cases, had developed both in the long term over hundreds of years of indigenous organization, but also in the short term, oddly enough, under neoliberal regimes that thought they should decentralize because that's what neoliberal regimes do, that actually give a lot of local power that enabled the structures to form. So not all of it's is always on purpose, but I think at least for a start, if we demand that actors don't break them, we'll actually get pretty far.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Matt. I guess I was sort of reflecting what you were describing in Bolivia on the mining and company interface side of things with some of my experience in the sort of international organization and funding space side of things. And I think there's some principles that sort of play across. And one is not expecting a sort of transactional linear relationship between the sort of global actor or the new, the visitor into a community and the community, but thinking about some of those principles of sort of how good collaboration or good initiatives can be instigated, supported, facilitated, and the sort of thought that triggered in my mind was around sort of community philanthropy actually. So the classic aid system, as I was describing earlier, is quite transactional. It's like we buy some outcomes by investing some chunks of money from the international players into like national and local contexts, and the way that's been communicated has been quite transactional, etc. But actually, if you create the community itself is investing its own resources, its own philanthropy, supplemented by then some external resources, then that's a really powerful thing, because that is owned locally, and that is there's a sort of a whole load of things that are built into that: accountability, control, hopefully sort of power, equitable sort of spaces, but not necessarily. And that's, obviously one to watch, internal power dynamics. But there are sort of clever ways that you can build international solidarity and support into local systems, local interactions and setup. So I just wanted to sort of share that leap, I guess, between the two different topics. Anybody else?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everyone sitting around me here. No, you're quite right, funnily enough. And that there's a whole lot of panel discussion about empowering communities, right? That's really another really difficult, complicated thing to achieve. But when it's right, as you say, don't break it, and it actually could be really effective. And I think that is also what I have seen where it works. I was just reminded of the UK government's just given Blackbird Leys or Greater Leys £20 million for the next 10 years, and insisted on the structure that's going to be governing that from the community itself, a board to do that. I guess the only thing I would add to maybe explain this and to bear in mind when setting these things up is that the things that I talked about before, which we've predictably come up again about trust and alignments and those kind of things, they're all personal relationship things. A company can't trust anyone, a gold company can't do it, mine can't do it. So people have got to do that. And so that somehow has to be, when it's going to work, it's because that works, because there is trust and enough alignment and confidence and so on. And I think that's maybe the magic ingredient.
So my answer to what facilitates the conditions is, and I'm going to make a huge generalization here, is that many countries have had a paradigm of 3 swim lanes. Government does this, schools, economy, blah, 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 defense, business grows money, and civil society does, the care, etc. And over the last sort of, say, 50 years, it's generally made the world better, that model. I was just doing a little bit of research, so that in 1960, there was 60% of the world lived below the poverty line. Now it's 9%. Life expectancy has tremendously improved. The amount of girls in education has tremendously improved. And so up to this point, life was generally getting better for people. So when I started this journey 2014 and I was living in Singapore, people kind of going, but this model is working. We're tremendously better off than our parents, and they were better off than their parents, etc. But now we've hit the stage where the world doesn't look better for the future generations. And so when people say, well, are you sure? If you use the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there's 169 targets. We're only on track for 17% of them, and 35% are now going backwards or stagnating. So we undeniably hit a point where that model of the 3 swim lanes isn't working. And I think that's a good thing. And I came across this concept recently about stable and unstable systems. And I think the definition is like, if you think of a ball in a valley, that's a stable system. And so we've been trying to shift stuff on climate and inequality, but generally the system was working for most, and so it's stable. But now the ball is on the top of a hill, and we can kick it one way or another. And that's the point that we're at now. And so, which is scary and exciting, but now it's unstable. It's now up for us which way we kick the ball. And so to facilitate this, my answer is we are now in an unstable situation, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what we do.
Okay, or maybe both. And that perfectly tees up the next set of questions I wanted to go to, which is really around the moment we're in, what some would describe as sort of a post-global world, the instability, fragmentation, polarization. What does global even mean in this context, right? And so the question that I have for all of you, and Matt, I want to start with you, is sort of how do you think about this sort of instability and fragmentation and sort of the disruption of the sort of global order as we knew it. And what does it offer up for local actors in terms of the possibilities for having influence on sustainability issues? Because you emphasize, of course, the value of the frameworks that we had, I would say, and perhaps still have, but are being called into question very much.
Yes, that's a really difficult question because it's in flux, right? And so I mean, when I'm teaching this, I've been telling my students that if someone predicts where they know the global order is going to go, you should stop listening to them because they're making it up. So the people that you should listen to are the people who say, I don't know, and then elaborate on the I don't know. So it doesn't mean that you don't know anything, right? I think one thing that's interesting, you described this sort of 3-lane world, right? And I think when I look back at the last 30 years, a lot of us who were trying to deal with sustainability were beating ourselves up because during the 90s and during sort of the peak neoliberal era, we had given up on the state as a solution. Right? There was this idea that civil society, the market, they were going to solve it because globalization was rendering the state too weak, and that the sort of the echoes of the Chicago School were making it too hard to do this. And we were constantly beating ourselves up for why are we doing that? Why are we giving up on international law and going with soft law? Why are we trying to do these networks of collaboration when we should be saving the real institutions, the hard stuff that actually makes changes? And I think the scary moment that we're in now is that those real hard stuff, that Bretton Woods that seems so inadequate, is now being pulled out from under us. And that second best story that we were telling ourselves and beating ourselves up for compromising to actually seems like the only game in town for the moment. And that's really frightening. And what's also really frightening is that those constraints globally, where certain actors would be at least embarrassed to violate global norms, aren't anymore. And that then allows powerful actors to have a little bit more free reign and be a little bit less constrained by global norms than they were. And that's quite scary because that could then start shutting down some of these opportunities, right? But I think then what we need to do is we need to try to reimagine how do we reconstruct this with the lessons we've learned from the past in a fragmented global order where it's going to be multipolar, probably. And how do we then use that multipolarity to deal with this? So I go to Peru often, and it's fascinating. Every time I'm there, I ask about China because China is ever more present. And every company and every organization is looking to China and also looking to the West, and it's messy. But on the other hand, it's super empowering because they're saying, well, we get to choose now, and we're going to play one group off the other. Now, they can play one group off the other in a way that is really unsustainable and really bad for human rights, or they can create room to maneuver that actually turns out to be quite productive. So I think that opening up is the little glimmer of hope that maybe I would communicate in an otherwise, I think, fairly dark situation.
Okay, thank you. Jenny, I want to ask you any reflections on this from what you're seeing in terms of the organizations that you're working with, or any glimmers of hope to pick up on where Matt ended.
I mean, where to start? There's so much change, right? And that is the constant conversation that we're having in our work every day. So how do you help sort of people who want to contribute to sustainability and make a positive change in the world to have that hope and to sort of grip the very, very fluid, disrupted context that we're all trying to sort of grapple with? So what we've done as one tool in that is to work around sort of imaginary futures. So we work with civil society organizations to say, okay, we can't grip it, we can't predict it, but hey, it could go this way. Or, imagine a world that goes this way in 5 years' time. And slightly chillingly, actually, we've been doing this for about 5 years. And, some of those futures have come true. Not necessarily the ones that you'd want. But, keeping organizations and activists and people who want to sort of contribute, thinking forwards in a sort of imaginary way, I think is helpful because, you know, a few years ago, we were all a little comfortable, maybe, you know, and pre-COVID, the world, we couldn't imagine going through that massive disruption. Now we've done that, and that seems like old news, right? But just using that sort of imaginary futures methodology has been actually really helpful for quite a few organizations and individuals that we've worked with, for them to just go, actually, do you know what? The way we're working right now is outdated. We are going to have to really change. We're going to have to really change the conversation with our supporters. We're going to have to change who our supporters are. We're going to have to change where we assume we should work, how we should work, etc. So there's got to be disruption in our community of sort of people who are trying to change the world, if you like, as well. We've got to keep up somehow in this massively disrupted and very, very fluid context. So, yeah.
Thank you. Similarly, I agree, and thank you for your glimmer of hope. That's why it's good to have people not in the melee thinking about these things, so I appreciate it. But yes, imagining positive futures, or just imagining futures.
Imagining futures, yeah.
Is not necessarily positive, you're quite right. I'm just trying to be positive. But yeah, imagining futures, I've also seen that being very effective and very helpful if you can get people to just transport themselves into a different time is useful. I guess I was also just thinking about my daughter, who's just 22, who often tells me how disastrous the world is, and I'm kind of, you should have seen it 22 years ago. To your point, Mac, you know, we have made some progress, not enough, but some progress. But I find that I have found that, I guess maybe to my previous point about getting the people who are going to be the pioneers and to imagine future, and encouraging and supporting them and allowing them to imagine those futures is really maybe the best we can do, because so much change is disempowering and scary to so many people that it really do look to people, to all of us, but to be led by the people who can imagine and help them imagine. So I definitely agree with that. That's what I was saying.
Just before we go to you, Mac, I just want to reflect on that, because we just did a seminar at the Skoll Center at the Business School last month on imagineering the future, and we talked about both what does that look like in practice and with some of the kinds of organizations that you all work with, but also for the academics in the room, what does that look like in our research, and how can we think differently about our research of the kinds of questions that we ask, but our methods in particular, and our ways of valuing and evaluating research that can allow us to do that kind of work. So encourage you all to dig into that if that's a topic of interest. And Mac, I just want to close with you and reflection on this last bit of conversation, but in particular, how you're seeing some of this sort of post-global chaos, fragmentation, and instability show up in terms of the work that you do to create a common framework for collaboration.
Thank you. My answer would be around, it's about process and how we turn up as leaders. So the process is one slide I was allowed to show, the methodology, and then the second thing is how do we get more and more people to be what we call alchemist leaders? Some people call them change makers. But how do you get cross society stepping up and going, I'm going to be a force for good. I'm going to solve these problems, and what can you do to catalyze that? And we basically have a number of things that we think are important. The first one is around agency, where you believe you've got the power to solve these problems, and so you either, if you don't have agency, you won't even have the courage to go for it. And how do you get agency is what we say is just get involved. And try something that's difficult and important, and in that process you will come out of it a different person. So if you think about the people who are famous in the world, who've changed the world, they all were at the wrong place at the wrong time, right? Or the right place at the right time. So the famous people of Christiana Ferreras, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, they were all at the wrong place at the wrong time, and it catalyzed them into this sense of agency. And so that's our first invitation. Get out. I hope it's a good show. I used to be here many years ago. I used to be a boxer, and And what's really interesting about, I was a terrible boxer, I want to say, but what's really interesting about boxing is it takes courage to get in the ring. You have no idea what's about to happen. And so my invitation is get into the boxing ring of life, take on some challenge of great significance and that's significant to you, and then you'll become a different person. And so that's the first thing, get into the boxing ring of life, and that you will find your agency. Second is you've got to become really amazing at coalition building. So if you're a government leader, you've got to become great at coalition building in business and civil society, and learn that skill of finding that network, invest maybe 10-20% of every day into coalition building, because we know we've got to work across government, business and civil society, no matter where your starting point. Third is become good at sense making and understanding the complexities of stuff. And then fourth is have a dream, have a vision. And with those four things, you'll become an alchemist leader and be able to change things.
Okay, thank you. And it's a wonderful place to end this part of the discussion. Before we go to the Q&A, I just want to thank the four of you for your sharing your insights and your experience. And please join me in thanking the speakers.